endless fights over how to parent Archie and Lily. It is the understanding of the Mark Dolan show that Prince Harry is furious with Meghan and her latest efforts to exploit their offspring for financial and career gain. Yes, folks, Meghan is at it again.
Something about this story feels different, because this isn't just another headline involving Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. This is about children, identity, and a decision that may have crossed a line the royal family once tried to protect, and now the question is no longer what happened, but why it happened at all. It starts with something that, on the surface, looks almost harmless, because when people first saw the Mother's Day collection released under Meghan Markle's lifestyle brand, the attention wasn't immediate outrage, it was curiosity, the kind of curiosity that surrounds celebrity launches, premium candles, emotional storytelling, and carefully curated branding, but according to product details outlined in what seemed like a simple commercial release quickly revealed something far more layered. Once people began reading the descriptions more closely. Because these were not just candles. These were candles directly tied to Prince Archie of Sussex and Princess Lilibet of Sussex, described using their full royal titles, with references not only to their birthdays but to deeply personal details, including specific scent notes connected to identity, such as the mention of red hair through ginger fragrance, and that is where everything begins to shift. Because once a child's personal identity is embedded inside a commercial product, especially under royal branding.
Now, Harry saw himself as an exploited commodity for public consumption when he was growing up as a young prince. So it's something that he just doesn't want for Archie and Lily. Now, it's our understanding that the latest flashpoint follows months of bitter rows over the endless Instagram posts of Archie and Lily, which are not only unroyal, those Instagram posts, right, on social media.
The conversation stops being about lifestyle and starts becoming about boundaries. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself this. When a brand begins using the identity of children who have never chosen public life, does that remain storytelling, or does it become something else entirely? Because this is exactly where the tension surrounding Prince Harry and Meghan Markle begins to intensify, not just publicly, but reportedly within their own relationship, because multiple reports suggest that this launch may not have been a unified decision, and that introduces a completely different layer to the story, one that goes beyond business and into personal conflict. And this is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Because when Prince Harry and Meghan Markle stepped away from the royal family in 2020, one of the most powerful arguments they made was about privacy, about protecting their children from the exact environment that had defined Harry's own childhood, the constant attention, the lack of control, the sense of being observed and consumed by the public before being able to define yourself as an individual. And yet now, years later, those same children appear within product descriptions sold globally under their royal titles. So now the question becomes sharper. Is this protection? Or is this exposure in a different form? Because depending on how you interpret this moment, the answer completely changes the narrative. Some argue that Meghan Markle is simply building a modern lifestyle brand, one that relies on personal storytelling to create emotional connection, something that is completely normal in today's digital economy, while others believe that this represents a clear contradiction of the values that were publicly stated during the royal exit, especially when those values were centered around shielding Archie and Lilibet from exactly this kind of visibility.
Your mother is Meghan Markle. You will not have a carefree childhood. You will be monetized because everything for Meghan is transactional, including that marriage to Harry.
And that's where the emotional layer begins to deepen. Because according to the details in, one of the most discussed aspects is not just the use of names or birthdays, but the inclusion of highly specific personal references, such as hair color, something that may appear subtle but becomes significantly more sensitive when applied to a young child who has not chosen to be part of a public narrative. And that detail alone has led many observers to question whether a boundary has quietly been crossed. But here's where the story becomes even more complex. Because this is not just about Meghan Markle. This is about Prince Harry. Because if reports suggesting his frustration are accurate, then what we are seeing is not just a public controversy, but a private conflict rooted in lived experience. Because Prince Harry has repeatedly spoken about what it felt like to grow up as a public figure, to feel like a product, to have personal details analyzed, discussed, and consumed, and if that history is now influencing how he views the situation, then this is no longer just a branding decision. It becomes something deeply personal. So now ask yourself this. If someone has lived through the experience of being treated as a public commodity, how would they react to seeing similar patterns begin to form around their own children? Because that question sits at the heart of this entire story. And it doesn't stop there. Because once royal titles enter the conversation, everything becomes even more sensitive. Because titles like Prince Archie of Sussex and Princess Lilibet of Sussex are not just symbolic labels, they are tied to the institution itself, to the monarchy, to agreements that were put in place when Prince Harry and Meghan Markle stepped back from royal duties, including understandings about how those titles should and should not be used, particularly in commercial contexts. And this is where another layer of tension begins to emerge. Because if those titles are now appearing in product descriptions, it raises a much larger question about whether those boundaries are still being respected, or whether they are being reinterpreted in a way that benefits a commercial narrative. So now the focus shifts again. Because this is no longer just about Harry and Meghan. This involves King Charles III. Because according to reports, there has been no clear public response from the monarchy, no direct intervention, no visible attempt to address the use of royal titles in this context, and that silence is beginning to attract attention of its own, because when an institution known for strict control chooses not to act, it creates uncertainty. Now ask yourself this: when authority remains silent in the face of a potential boundary being crossed, does that signal control, or does it suggest limitation? Because that distinction changes how this entire situation is interpreted. And that's where another key figure enters the frame. Because many believe that this moment is being closely observed by Prince William, the future king, the one expected to take a more defined stance on the use of royal identity moving forward. And if that's true, then what we're witnessing right now may not just be a controversy. It may be a test. A test of boundaries. A test of authority. A test of how far things can go before something changes.
And is described on the candle as Prince Archie of Sussex's birthday. You're welcome, my husband. Now, the fragrance is said to be a warm, comforting scent inspired by Prince Archie of Sussex's birth date, bringing a soft, familiar ease into the room.
So now the question becomes unavoidable. If this moment represents a line being pushed, what happens when that line is finally enforced? Because what comes next is where this story stops being quiet and starts becoming something much bigger. As the initial shock of the candle launch begins to settle, the story doesn't slow down. It actually sharpens, because once people move past the product itself and start looking at the pattern behind it, a much deeper tension begins to emerge, one that is not about candles, branding, or even public reaction, but about two completely different visions of what life after the monarchy was supposed to look like for Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. And this is where the situation becomes far more complicated than it first appeared. Because according to the broader narrative outlined in This Moment did not come out of nowhere, it follows months of growing tension, particularly around how Prince Archie of Sussex and Princess Lilibet of Sussex are being presented publicly, whether through social media posts, curated appearances, or now through commercial storytelling. And when these elements are placed together, they begin to form a pattern that is difficult to ignore, especially for those who have been closely following how the couple has evolved since stepping away from the royal family. Now pause and ask yourself this: when a single action aligns with a series of similar decisions, does it remain isolated, or does it start to reveal a broader strategy? Because that question sits at the center of this phase of the story. And this is where the contrast between Prince Harry and Meghan Markle becomes impossible to overlook, because while both left the royal institution together, the way they appear to be navigating life outside of it may not be as aligned as it once seemed, particularly when it comes to something as sensitive as their children's visibility and identity. Because Prince Harry's perspective is shaped by experience. He grew up inside the system. He understands what it means to be photographed, analyzed, and discussed from childhood, to have personal details become public property, to feel like an identity is formed externally before it is ever formed internally, and according to reports, that experience has always influenced his desire to protect his children from the same environment, to give them something he never fully had, a private childhood. But here's where the tension begins to rise. Because Meghan Markle's approach appears to operate within a completely different framework, one that reflects the modern reality of branding, storytelling, and audience connection, where personal narratives are not hidden, but used as the foundation for building influence, trust, and ultimately commercial success. And when those two frameworks collide, the result is not just disagreement. It is friction. So now ask yourself this: can a relationship truly balance two completely different philosophies about privacy and visibility without eventually reaching a breaking point? Because that is exactly what many observers believe we are beginning to see. And this is where the candle launch becomes more than just a product. it becomes a signal. Because according to, the inclusion of Prince Archie of Sussex and Princess Lilibet of Sussex in product descriptions is not just about emotional storytelling, it is about value creation. Because in the world of lifestyle branding, authenticity drives demand, and nothing feels more authentic than personal connection, especially when that connection is tied to family, identity, and narrative. But here's the part that changes everything. Because when that authenticity is built on the identities of children, it introduces a completely different set of questions. Questions about consent, about long-term impact, and about whether those children will eventually have to live with decisions that were made long before they were able to understand them. And that's where the emotional weight of this story becomes impossible to ignore. Because this is not just about what is happening now. It is about what this means later. Because according to the same narrative, once these details are placed into the public domain, they do not disappear, they become part of a permanent record, something that can be revisited, analyzed, and discussed years into the future, and that permanence is what makes this moment feel so significant. Now pause again and ask yourself this. If a child's identity becomes part of a commercial narrative today, what happens when that child grows up and begins to understand how that narrative was created? Because that question sits at the heart of the entire controversy. And it doesn't stop there. Because once royal titles enter the equation, the situation moves from personal into institutional territory. Because titles like Prince Archie of Sussex and Princess Lilibet of Sussex are not just family identifiers, they are part of a larger system, one that operates under specific expectations, agreements, and traditions, particularly when it comes to how those titles are used outside official duties. And this is where the role of King Charles III becomes increasingly relevant, because as the current monarch, he represents the authority behind those titles, the one expected to maintain the integrity of the institution, and yet, according to reports, there has been no direct response, no visible action, no clear attempt to address how these titles are being used in a commercial context. So now the question becomes even sharper. When an institution chooses not to respond to something that appears to challenge its own boundaries, is that a sign of strategic restraint, or a sign that its influence has limits? Because perception begins to shift in moments like this. And perception is everything when it comes to institutions like the monarchy. But here's where the story takes another turn. Because while King Charles III remains silent, attention begins to shift toward Prince William, the future king, the one many believe will take a different approach to these kinds of situations, particularly when it comes to protecting the long-term credibility of the royal family. And if that's true, then what we are witnessing right now may not just be a moment of tension. It may be a transition between two styles of leadership. One defined by restraint, the other potentially defined by action. And that changes everything. Because if Prince William eventually steps into a position where he can redefine how royal titles are used, then moments like this will not just be remembered as controversies. They will be remembered as turning points. So now ask yourself this. Are we watching a temporary conflict between Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, or are we witnessing the early stages of a much larger shift within the royal family itself? Because that is where this story is heading next. And once that shift begins, it may not be easy to reverse. As the focus moves beyond the pattern and into the consequences of that pattern, the story begins to feel heavier, because what initially looked like a disagreement between Prince Harry and Meghan Markle now starts to reveal something far more uncomfortable. Something about control, about identity, and about what happens when a personal boundary becomes a commercial strategy, and according to the broader narrative outlined in, this is exactly where the situation begins to shift from tension into consequence. Because here's what changes everything. This is no longer just about how Prince Archie of Sussex and Princess Lilibet of Sussex are being presented today. It is about how those decisions will define them tomorrow. Because once a child's identity is placed into a commercial framework, especially one tied to royal titles, it doesn't simply exist in the moment. It becomes part of a permanent narrative, something that follows them as they grow. Something that shapes how they are perceived before they even have the chance to define themselves. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself this. When identity is built publicly before it is built personally, who is really in control of that identity? Because that question sits at the center of everything that is unfolding here. And this is where the perspective of Prince Harry becomes even more critical, because his entire life has been shaped by that exact experience. Growing up as a royal figure whose identity was constructed in public view, analyzed, interpreted, and often misunderstood. And if reports suggesting his frustration are accurate, then what we are seeing now is not just disagreement. It is recognition. Recognition of a pattern he has already lived through and may now be seeing repeated. But here's where the situation becomes even more complex. Because Meghan Markle's approach, as reflected in the As Ever brand, appears to operate on a completely different principle, one where identity is not something to be hidden, but something to be shared, shaped, and even monetized as part of a broader narrative. And in today's digital economy, that approach is not unusual. In fact, it is often rewarded, because audiences respond to authenticity, to personal stories, to emotional connection. So now the question becomes sharper. When one person sees identity as something to protect, and the other sees it as something to share, how do those two perspectives coexist? Because this is where the friction becomes unavoidable. And this is where the story begins to move into something even more sensitive. Because according to, the inclusion of royal titles and product descriptions adds an entirely new layer to the situation, because those titles are not just personal identifiers, they are institutional markers, tied to the monarchy, to its authority, and to the agreements that were put in place when Prince Harry and Meghan Markle stepped away from official duties. Agreements that were meant to define how those titles could be used outside the royal framework. And that raises a question that cannot be ignored. If those titles are now being used in commercial contexts, what does that mean for the authority of the institution itself? Because this is where the role of King Charles III becomes increasingly significant, because as the current monarch, he represents the system behind those titles, the structure that gives them meaning, and yet, according to reports, there has been no visible response, no direct intervention, no public clarification, and that silence is beginning to shape perception in ways that may be difficult to reverse. Now ask yourself this. When authority remains silent while its symbols are being used in new ways, does that strengthen the system, or does it weaken it? Because perception is everything. And once perception begins to shift, even slightly, it can influence how every future decision is interpreted. But here's where the story takes another turn. Because while King Charles III remains silent, attention continues to move toward Prince William, the future king, the one many believe will take a more defined and structured approach to protecting the integrity of the monarchy, particularly when it comes to the use of royal identity in commercial contexts. And if that expectation is accurate, then what we are witnessing right now may not just be a controversy. It may be a setup for a future shift in how these situations are handled. And that changes the entire perspective. Because instead of seeing this as an isolated conflict, it begins to look like part of a larger transition, one where the monarchy itself is evolving, adapting to new realities while also trying to maintain its core identity. So now the question becomes even more important. Is this moment a reflection of change, or a challenge to it? Because depending on how it is handled moving forward, it could become either. And this is where the emotional dimension deepens again. Because beyond strategy, beyond perception, beyond institutional authority, there are real relationships at the center of this story. Relationships between Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, between Prince Harry and King Charles III, between Prince Harry and Prince William, relationships shaped by history, by expectation, and by choices that carry consequences far beyond the present moment. And once those relationships begin to feel strained, even subtly, the effects are not contained. They ripple outward. So now ask yourself this. If these tensions continue to build, what kind of decision would it take to resolve them? Because every story like this moves toward a point where something has to give. A line has to be drawn. A direction has to be chosen. And when that moment arrives, it doesn't just resolve the conflict. It defines the future. And that is exactly where this story is heading next. Because the next phase is not about what has already happened. It is about what happens when the pressure becomes impossible to ignore. And when that moment comes, everything changes. As the pressure continues to build and the narrative moves toward its most decisive phase, the story begins to reveal something far more structural than emotional, because what initially appeared to be a disagreement between Prince Harry and Meghan Markle now starts to look like a collision between two systems, one rooted in institutional control and legacy, and the other driven by modern branding, visibility, and commercial independence. And according to the evolving narrative surrounding the As Ever launch detailed in, this collision is no longer subtle, it is becoming visible in ways that are difficult to contain. Because here's where everything changes. This is no longer just about Prince Archie of Sussex and Princess Lilibet of Sussex appearing in product descriptions. It is about what that decision represents at a structural level, because once royal identity is used in a commercial framework, even indirectly, it begins to redefine what those titles mean, not just for Harry and Meghan, but for the monarchy itself. And that is where the tension shifts from personal to institutional. Now pause and ask yourself this. If royal titles can be used this way without consequence, what stops them from being used even more directly in the future? Because that question sits at the center of this entire phase of the story. And this is where the silence from King Charles III becomes even more significant, because silence in a moment like this is not neutral. It is interpreted, it is analyzed, and it becomes part of the narrative itself, because when the monarchy does not visibly respond to something that appears to challenge its own boundaries, it creates uncertainty about where those boundaries actually are. But here's where the interpretation splits. Some believe that this silence reflects strategy, a deliberate decision by King Charles III to avoid escalating the situation publicly, to maintain stability by not turning a controversy into a confrontation, while others see the same silence as limitation, as a sign that the monarchy may not have the same level of influence over external actions as it once did, especially when those actions are happening outside the institutional framework. So now the question becomes sharper. Is this silence control, or is it constraint? Because the answer to that question determines how this entire situation is understood. And this is where the focus shifts again. Because if King Charles III represents the present, then Prince William represents the future. And according to many observers, this is the moment where that future begins to take shape, because Prince William is widely expected to take a more defined approach to protecting the integrity of the monarchy, particularly when it comes to how royal titles are used. And if that expectation holds true, then what we are seeing right now may not just be a controversy. It may be a boundary test. A test of how far things can go under the current system. And that changes the stakes entirely. Because if this is a test, then it implies something important. That a response may come. But not yet. Now ask yourself this. If a future king is watching a situation like this unfold, what kind of precedent is being set in real time? Because precedents matter. They define what is acceptable. They shape how future decisions are made. And once a precedent is established, it becomes much harder to reverse. And this is where the story moves into its most uncomfortable layer. Because beyond institutional authority and public perception, there is a deeper question about value. Because according to the commercial strategy behind the as-ever brand relies heavily on emotional connection, on the idea that products become more valuable when they are tied to personal stories, to family, to identity, and in this case, that identity includes royal titles, children's birthdays, and personal characteristics, all of which contribute to the perceived value of the product. But here's the part that changes everything. Because if that emotional value is built on the identities of Prince Archie of Sussex and Princess Lilibet of Sussex, then those children are not just part of the story. They become part of the product. And that is where the line becomes difficult to define. Now pause again and ask yourself this. When identity becomes part of value creation, where does storytelling end and commercialization begin? Because that question is not just philosophical. It is practical. It affects how this situation will be judged over time. And this is where the emotional dimension returns in full force. Because for Prince Harry, this is not abstract. This is personal. Because his entire life has been shaped by the experience of being part of a system where identity and value were closely linked, where his role as a prince defined not only how he was seen, but how he was used within the broader narrative of the monarchy. And if reports suggesting his frustration are accurate, then what we are seeing is not just disagreement. It is a conflict between past and present, between experience and strategy, between protection and exposure. So now the question becomes unavoidable. If Prince Harry understands the cost of being treated as a public commodity, how does he respond when similar dynamics appear around his own children? Because that is where the story begins to move toward its climax. But before that moment arrives, there is one more layer that cannot be ignored. Because this situation is not happening in isolation. It exists within a broader context of evolving relationships, shifting authority, and changing expectations within the royal family. And each of those elements influences how this moment is interpreted, not just as a standalone event, but as part of a larger transformation. And that transformation is still unfolding. Now ask yourself this. Are we watching a temporary conflict driven by individual decisions, or are we witnessing the early stages of a structural shift in how the monarchy interacts with modern commercial reality? Because the answer to that question will define what happens next. And what happens next is where everything comes to a head. Because once pressure reaches a certain point, a decision is no longer optional. It becomes inevitable. And that is exactly where this story is heading, into its final phase, where silence, tension, and expectation collide. And something finally has to change. As everything begins to converge in this final phase, the story stops feeling like a controversy and starts feeling like a turning point, because once patterns, tensions, and silence all align at the same time, what you are left with is not uncertainty, but pressure, and according to the broader narrative outlined in, that pressure is no longer building quietly behind the scenes. It is now visible in the way people are interpreting every move made by Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, and more. Importantly, in the way the monarchy itself is being perceived in response. Because here's what makes this moment different. Nothing has officially been announced, no statement has been made, no direct confrontation has taken place, and yet, everything feels like it has already shifted, because once a boundary appears to have been tested publicly, the absence of a response becomes part of the response itself, shaping how people understand the authority of King Charles III and the future direction of the institution he represents. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself this. When an institution known for strict control allows a situation like this to continue without visible intervention, does that reflect confidence? Or does it reveal limitation? Because that question sits at the center of how this entire story will be remembered. And this is where the narrative begins to crystallize. Because on one side, there is a modern commercial strategy driven by Meghan Markle, one that integrates identity, storytelling, and emotional connection into a brand that operates outside the traditional boundaries of the monarchy, and on the other side, there is a system built on restraint, tradition, and carefully managed identity, a system that now appears to be watching rather than acting. But here's where the tension becomes unavoidable, because those two systems cannot operate indefinitely without eventually colliding in a way that forces a decision. And that decision is what everyone is now waiting for. So now ask yourself this. How long can a system remain silent before that silence starts to redefine its authority? Because silence, over time, becomes interpretation. And interpretation becomes perception. And perception, in a monarchy, is everything. But here's where the story takes its most revealing turn. Because according to the narrative in, this situation is not just about what has been done, it is about what it represents going forward. Because if the use of royal titles, personal identity, and family narrative in commercial products continues without restriction, then it sets a precedent. One that extends beyond Prince Harry and Meghan Markle and into the broader question of how royal identity can be used in the modern world. And that precedent matters. Because once it is established, it becomes much harder to undo. Now pause again and ask yourself this. If this becomes the new normal, what does that mean for the future of the monarchy itself? Because this is no longer just about a candle. It is about control. About meaning. About whether royal identity remains something protected, or becomes something adaptable. And that brings us back to the most important figure in this entire equation. Because while King Charles III represents the present, Prince William represents the future, and many observers believe that this is exactly the kind of situation that will define how Prince William approaches leadership when that future arrives, particularly when it comes to setting clear boundaries around what is and is not acceptable in the use of royal identity. So now the question becomes even more direct. If Prince William were in a position to act today, would this situation look different? Because that question is not just hypothetical. It reflects the expectations people already have about the next phase of the monarchy. And those expectations are shaping how this moment is being interpreted right now. But here's where the emotional dimension returns one final time. Because beyond institutions, beyond strategy, beyond perception, there are real relationships at the center of this story. Relationships between Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, between Prince Harry and King Charles III, between Prince Harry and Prince William, relationships that have been tested, strained, and reshaped over time. And once those relationships reach a certain point of tension, they do not simply return to what they were. They evolve. Or they break. So now ask yourself this. If the direction we are seeing continues, what kind of outcome does it lead to? Because every story like this moves toward a moment where something has to change. A boundary is defined. A decision is made. A path is chosen. And when that moment arrives, it does not just resolve the situation. It defines what comes next. And that is exactly where we are now. Not at the beginning. Not even in the middle. But at the point where everything that has happened so far is leading toward a single outcome, one that will shape not only the future of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, but also the future of how the monarchy itself operates in a world that is changing faster than ever. So now it comes down to you. Do you see this as a controlled evolution, a modern adaptation of royal identity that reflects the realities of today's world, or do you see it as a line being crossed, one that could have long-term consequences for the monarchy and for the individuals at the center of the story. Let me know what you think in the comments, because your perspective matters here, and if you want more deep, high-retention breakdowns that go beyond headlines and uncover the real dynamics behind stories like this, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned, because the next development in this story may not just add to the narrative. It might completely redefine it.